We like to think that human nature is at the most fundamental level good, that given a chance to hurt or help others, most would choose to indulge the better side of their nature and come to the aid of someone in need, or at least do their best to cause no harm. But when confronted with the realities of the dark side of human nature, we are forced to rethink that position. For while the world has its share of misguided people who commit evil deeds, it also has seen its share of outright monsters. These are the 10 most evil human beings to ever walk the earth. Born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861, the man who would come to be known as H.H. Holmes began his career in crime as a petty con artist, despite being born to an affluent family. Highly intelligent, Holmes professed an ambition to become a doctor, and as a child would practice surgery on animals. Today we may recognize this as a potential warning sign of violent behavior to come, and one of his long-running cons also revealed a morbid bent to his personality, stealing corpses in order to submit false insurance claims. At the age of 25 and already using the alias Dr. Henry H. Holmes, he found work in a Chicago pharmacy, which he took over after its owner mysteriously vanished. He had additional stories built on top of the pharmacy, and it was in these rooms and halls that he would build an elaborate and bizarre house of torture and death. In the upper floor's tiny rooms, he would gas, brutalize, and murder his victims, sending their bodies down a chute to be incinerated in a kiln on the ground floor. During the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, Holmes opened his house to the public, and many of those who roomed there during this time did not survive the stay. Holmes was arrested in 1895 and tried for the murder of Mr. Benjamin Pitezel, who had agreed to fake his own death in one of Holmes' insurance schemes, only to be double-crossed. After his conviction, he confessed to no fewer than 27 murders over the previous few years, making him America's first serial killer. He was executed by hanging in 1896. The so-called Democratic People's Republic of Korea is one of the most brutal regimes that still exists in the world today. Cut off from economic opportunity and all but the most basic services, North Korea's citizens live under constant monitoring, with free speech and even free thought often violently suppressed. Founded by Kim Il-sung, leadership of the country was taken over in 1994 after its founder's death by his son, Kim Jong-il, whose reign of nearly 20 years intensified a living nightmare that North Koreans have yet to awaken from. Aside from its totalitarian philosophy, Kim's rule was marked by scandalous mismanagement of his country's funds, with the military prioritized over nearly everything else, including the health and comfort of North Korea's citizens. Throughout the 1990s, the country suffered from severe famine, with many governments going so far as to accuse Kim of crimes against humanity for his treatment of the populace. He set North Korea on a course of nuclear armament, against the wishes of the international community, that is a continuing threat to world stability, and routinely engaged in the kidnapping of foreign nationals, mainly South Koreans, for purposes ranging from simple propaganda to forced employment in North Korea's film industry. He established forced labor camps for enemies of the state, which still operate even today, and became notorious for extrajudicial executions. There's no telling how many millions of North Koreans suffered and died under his rule, but one thing is certain: conditions are no better in the country today. After Kim's death in 2011, he was replaced by his son Kim Jong-un, who has proved just as brutal and vicious a dictator as his father. In 1979, a man drowned while swimming off the coast of Brazil. His death caught the attention of investigators who had been pursuing Nazi officers ever since the end of World War II, many of whom had escaped to Brazil, Argentina, and other South American countries at the end of the war. It took 6 years, but they were finally able to exhume the man's remains in 1985 and confirm what they had already suspected. The 69-year-old deceased man was SS Surgeon Joseph Mengele, the notorious Angel of Death. During his time at Auschwitz, one of Mengele's chief duties was to decide who was healthy enough to work in the camp and who would immediately be put to death in the gas chambers. But he also saw in his position the opportunity to undertake ghoulish medical and genetic experiments on unwilling patients, pursuing the Nazis' twisted ideals of eugenics and racial superiority with no regard for the safety of his victims. A sadistic brute with no empathy. An untold number of men, women, and children died at Mengele's hands directly in the course of his experiments, with countless more executed under his orders. These experiments included unnecessary operations on pregnant women and children, the killing of subjects to study their eyes and organs, and sewing 2 children together back to back in an attempt to create conjoined twins, a procedure that killed both children from gangrene. Mengele eluded capture for 35 years after the war, living to a much older age than the vast majority of the patients unlucky enough to cross his path. Richard Kuklinski is a man who has gone by many names: the One-Man Army, the Devil himself, and most notably, the Iceman. For decades, these names inspired icy fear in the hearts of the criminal underworld, because if the Iceman came for you, your time was simply up. Kuklinski is the most prolific contract killer on record, a hitman with a startling catalog of kills. He claims to have become a killer in 1948 at the age of 13, and he plied his lethal trade for nearly 4 decades before he was finally captured. He came by his famous nickname by his obviously successful method of throwing police off of his trail, freezing his victims in an industrial freezer before thawing them out and dumping them for cops to find, effectively masking the time of death. It took 18 months for police to piece together their investigation into him, relying solely on physical evidence and Kuklinski's increasing propensity to make small mistakes as his career wore on. No eyewitness testimony against him was ever provided, as Kuklinski claims to have killed anyone who could ever have testified against him. While he was convicted of only 5 murders, police suspect that over 100 people may have died by his hand, and Kuklinski himself estimates far more. He claims to have started killing nearly anyone who annoyed him as a teenager, and to have committed a great many more murders than he was ever paid for, using practically every method imaginable from shootings and poisonings to bare-hand beatings, which he said he would carry out just for the exercise. Kuklinski was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences in 1988 and died in prison in 2005 at the age of 70. As many Americans know the face of Osama bin Laden as Elvis Presley or Michael Jackson, he was the most wanted man on the planet from September 11, 2001 until the end of his life at the hands of Navy SEALs on May 2, 2011 in a safe house in Pakistan. He was, of course, the founder of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization responsible for a number of devastating attacks on civilians, including those on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Raised by a billionaire family in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden was a devout Sunni Muslim whose militant activities began with the Mujahideen, Afghan rebels who were opposed to Soviet influence in the area. Ironically, the United States directly contributed to the Mujahideen's activities during this period. By the late 1980s, he had founded Al-Qaeda with the goal of making his radical brand of Islam victorious across the globe, and his first target was the United States. In 1998, Al-Qaeda carried out a series of bombings at U.S. embassies in several countries, killing over 200 and bringing him to the attention of the public for the first time. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, but the group succeeded in bombing a Navy warship, the USS Cole, in 2000, and assassinating an Afghan military official in 2001. Then in September of that year, their most heinous and destructive operation took place, one that Americans can never forget. Since then, the group has carried out dozens more bombings against civilian targets in Morocco, Indonesia, Madrid, London, Bali, and many more, killing hundreds and injuring thousands. Even though bin Laden himself couldn't ultimately escape justice, his brutal legacy is alive and well. François Duvalier of Haiti, a medical doctor by profession, became known as Papa Doc during his 14-year rule, which began in 1957. This rule was not unchallenged. There were attempted coups, insurrections, and other ploys by political opponents to remove him from power, and all were met with the swiftest and harshest possible punishment. Papa Doc perfected the cult of personality, making himself out to be more than just a leader, in fact more than just a man. He claimed to be at once the physical personification of the island nation, at one with the spirit of voodoo, and personally chosen to lead by Jesus Christ. He even published a pamphlet in which the Lord's Prayer was reworked to pay homage to him instead of God. He declared himself president for life in 1964, overseeing a government that was notorious for corruption and mismanagement of funds, even as its citizens suffered unspeakable hardships. As many as 60,000 people are estimated to have died in poverty or been outright murdered during his rule, which ended with his death from a heart attack in 1971. Idi Amin was the president of the African nation of Uganda for 8 years, from 1971 to 1979. A former military officer, Amin served as yet another example of what can happen when those with no conscience and no motivator other than personal power are allowed to rule a vulnerable country. Amin took power in a military coup, declaring himself president and promising to hold free and open democratic elections, which never came. Perhaps inspired by Papa Doc's earlier example, he used absolutely crushing force to hold on to power, stirring up hate and encouraging persecution of ethnic groups, political and religious leaders, journalists, judges, intellectuals, foreigners, and anyone else whom he perceived as a threat. The ruthless dictator was exiled in 1979 by Tanzanian forces joined by a militant group largely made up of those Amin himself had exiled. He lived the rest of his life in Saudi Arabia, dying in 2003 of kidney failure. He never expressed regret for the actions of his regime, which human rights groups estimated was responsible for anywhere between 100,000 and 500,000 deaths. The name Hitler is practically synonymous with evil throughout the entire world. The charismatic demagogue rose to power in Germany in 1933, quickly establishing his Nazi Party's poisonous rhetoric of intense German nationalism, paired with hatred and suspicion of foreigners, gypsies, gays, and especially Jews. It's well known that Hitler intended to spread his ideology as far as possible, and he may well have succeeded in achieving world domination if not for some crucial mistakes. Chief among these were engaging in a two-front war, sandwiched between Europe and Russia, which completely weakened his forces and led to the invasion of Germany by both the Allies and Russians in 1944. Had he not stretched his military so thin, the world may be a very different place today. In addition to all of the death and destruction wrought by Nazi Germany's actions during World War II, Hitler is of course ultimately responsible for the deaths of at least 6 million in Germany's concentration camps. That he is only number 3 on this list should serve as a reminder that evil truly knows no bounds. Perhaps it was the very visible spectacle of the concentration camps and the stories of those liberated from them that has caused Hitler to be remembered as the pinnacle of evil for the better part of the last century. But even within the same time period during the same war, the vicious regime of Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary and ruler of the Soviet Union, set an unthinkable new standard for death and misery. The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, but became instrumental in Hitler's downfall when Germany broke that pact by invading the USSR in 1941. During Stalin's rule, dissidents were forced into back-breaking labor camps known as gulags, and giant chunks of ethnic populations were forcibly deported, usually under brutal conditions. A famine from 1932 to 1933 alone may have killed close to 6 million Russians, and the number of those who died in the gulags and as a result of forced relocation may never be known. However, after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, Russian historians were finally able to gain access to enough records to venture a guess. According to one estimate, as many as 9 to 10 million Russians may have lost their lives during the 30-plus years of Stalin's rule, which ended in 1953 with his death from an undisclosed illness. Pol Pot was a communist revolutionary who forcibly took control of the small nation of Cambodia, also known as Kampuchea, in 1976. His reign ended 4 years later, as his government, known as the Khmer Rouge, collapsed after losing a 3-year war with Vietnam. In the 4 years in which he was in power, Pol Pot literally decimated the population of his country. He could have done this no more effectively if he were an invading hostile power. In an attempt to force Cambodia into a communist economy, vast numbers of its urban citizens were forcibly relocated to countryside labor camps and collective farms, working in unfathomable conditions without even the most basic access to nutritious food, medical care, and sanitation. While this was recognized as an ongoing human rights crisis at the time, the true scope of the evil which had fallen over Cambodia was brought to light after the dictator's ouster in 1979. It was estimated that anywhere between 1 and 3 million Cambodians died as a direct result of government policies under Pol Pot in 4 short years. While this may not approach the death toll of Hitler or Stalin, keep in mind that Cambodia is a smaller country, with a population of only about 8 million at the time. This means that under Pol Pot, over a quarter of the Cambodian population may have died in what infamously came to be known as the Killing Fields.